As the Beats had found a gathering place and support for their brand of bohemianism at City Light's bookstore, the early hippies found a similar locus for their growing up community at the Psychedelic Shop on 1535 Hyde Street. The Emporium was owned by Thalen brothers Ron and Jay, two college dropouts who went to Lake Tahoe, high on the Sierra Nevada mountains of Northern California, and one of the state's more high-end summer resort areas. There they opened a parking lot as well as a boat and beach umbrella rental business. The brothers did well, and in 1965 sold their business and returned to their home in the city by the bay. With their profits, they opened the Psychedelic Shop on January 3rd, 1966. Initially, the store only sold a variety of books and magazines, and of course rock and roll records, as well as some jazz and rhythm and blues. However, as the hippie movement unfolded on Hyde Street, in front of their stores, the brothers, quote, knew that a whole world was opening up and wanted to be part of it. They began stocking their store with staples that catered to and reflected the emerging hippie culture. Paisley fabrics, incense, dance and other psychedelic pop art posters and prints, occult books, and all manner of drug paraphernalia, from coloured zigzag paper used for rolling marijuana joints to roach clips and hash pipes. They also expanded their premises to include a meditation room, which Thalen later admitted became nothing more than a place where couples went to have sex in its darkened interior. Thalen confessed years later, quote, quite possibly a number of babies were conceived there. One of the psych shop's more innovative merchandising gimmicks was the placement of 3 folding chairs in its large storefront window, where patrons could sit and read or simply stare out the window at the passers-by. According to Thalen, quote, our window was a live display of whoever was sitting there looking out at people looking in on them. It blew a lot of minds. Our display was kind of a mirror image of the street action outside. As reflected in the type of merchandise the Thalen brothers carried in their store, the Heights' burgeoning hippie community was founded upon 2 saleable cultural commodities, drugs and music, both of which came to define much of the hippie lifestyle. As the Heights hippie community evolved, a definite, visible, collective look, attitude and presence emerged, revolving around drugs, music and fashion, which brought them together no matter where they were, San Francisco or the Bay Area, eventually nationally. Hippies best achieve community by becoming rooted, despite their alleged transient ways, to particular places. Thus, a hippie community like that in the Hyde-Ashbury was defined by place much as attitudes and behaviour. For the Heights' original hip residents, their respective lives became a concentrated social experiment, rather than a diffuse set of styles. For this reason, one of the signal events in the formation of the Hyde-Ashbury community was the opening of the Psychedelic Shop. According to Thalen, things were happening in the Hyde-Ashbury before we opened, but it seems like the Psychedelic Shop brought publicity to what was happening. Suddenly there was a common fact that everybody could identify with. It was right in the middle of town, and it was called the Psychedelic Shop. People started coming in, and then pretty soon it was like the whole Hyde-Ashbury was the community. The Psychedelic Shop's success brought other hip entrepreneurs to the Height, with many coming simply to tap into the potential financial goldmine of the burgeoning hippie movement. By mid-1966, Height, Page, Clayton and Ashbury streets were lined with a variety of stores with colourful names, all catering to hippie needs and wants. Far-fetched Foods, a health food establishment, In Gear, a mod clothing store, the Blushing Peony, a fancy hip chic boutique, and the I Thou coffee shop. Later there would be Print Mint, a posters and photographic picture shop, the Drog, Sick Store, a comparatively posh and expensive apothecary and ice cream parlour with paisley top tables, and a proliferation of many others. Hippie store owners and vendors' protestations to the contrary noted the above set-up shop in Ashbury not to make money off the hippie thing. Many, such as the Thalen brothers, made relative fortunes while in business. frequently engaging in activities as capitalistically avaricious and opportunistic as the straight business establishments they roundly condemned for their profiteering. When hip merchants sensed that the hippie fad was beginning to wane, they sold their respective businesses, many for handsome profits, all at the expense of their love generation compatriots. As the money rolled in, so did the criticism from the larger hippie community, many of whom believed that their shop owner brethren were taking advantage of a captive market by charging inflated or even exorbitant prices for goods and services that would be much less outside of the Hashbury. As Hunter Thompson noted, High Street, the great white wave what local papers called hippie land, is already dotted with stores catering mainly to the tourist trade. Few hippies can afford a pair of $20 sandals or a mod outfit for $67. Most hype boutiques sold mass-produced, antique, ready-to-wear clothing, customized with psychedelic touches, ranging from $20 for a paisley men's shirt to $30 for a hippie sack dress. Such unexpected reproach not only shocked the hip business community, but forced many to publicly explain or justify their making money, which had become anathema in the new hippie ethos. As hip essayist Guy Strait declared in an op-ed for the Oracle, quote, "It has been demonstrated over and over again throughout history that it is the fight for money and possessions and the prestige they bring that sets people at odds, and that is what makes the world hard." Unquote. Strait further opined that it was the security hypochondria, this checking of bank books rather than pulses, currently afflicting millions of adult Americans, especially the parents of the white suburban youth, that was causing such widespread disaffection throughout the hip community. It was this frantic concern for money that was driving so many young white Americans into the Haight-Ashbury. They, the parents, have thought so long in terms of money and possessions that they have forgotten how to think in terms of people. Hip merchants called on Ron Thalen to speak on their behalf and convey to the tribe, the term used by hippies in reference to their compatriots, their position on money-making. Thalen believed that because he and his fellow hippies were embarked on the evolution of a new culture, it was going to take time to figure out how to do the right thing and have this money thing. It's hard because of all the bad habits we have. We have to find new means of exchange. We must free ourselves from all those other habits before we can discover how to deal with money intelligently. I understand that money is energy and that it has to flow. It's a matter of channeling, but it's also a matter of habit. This money thing, like it's hard to figure out the economic mechanism that makes sense to the community. Thalen admitted that when he first opened his store, he personally, quote, operated within the profit motive. And regardless of how strong and beautiful the person is, if he allowed the desire for profit to dictate his business practices, then you were going to get fucked up. That's the nature of it. That's what it does to you. To Thalen, it was greed, not money itself, that was causing the outcry. Quote, although almost all of us were exposed to this disease in childhood, but dope and love are curing us. Thus, in Thalen's view, the only way for himself and the other hip merchants to expiate their afflicted past and relieve themselves of the public scorn associated with the money thing was to absolve themselves of the profit motive, greed, by investing in the community to improve conditions for all, and to give away all we have beyond our needs, including money. As bizarre as it sounded, Thalen made good his public declarations, as he indeed did give a lot of the store items to the increasing hordes of vagrant street hippies. He also donated thousands of dollars to various hip enterprises and charities, as did other hip merchants. However, Thalen continued to earn huge profits from his store, sufficient to afford him annual months-long trips to India and Europe, and to be able to travel all over the United States for extended periods of time, visiting and staying for several weeks with various Native American tribes on their respective reservations. Part of Ron Thalen's and the other hip shop owners' quest for a new economy for the Hashbury was to transform Hyde Street into a world-famous dope centre where every little store would be like fine tea shops, where there'd be fine jars of marijuana and chemist shops with fine psychedelic chemicals, where the real tea shops with fine tea, where there are fine restaurants with organic or macrobiotic, really good nutritious foods, where there are smoking dens with a beautiful mall the length of Hyde Street, fine foods and drugs, all free or for trade. Suffice to say, Thalen's vision for the Height did not quite become a reality, at least in the sense of fine or quaint or refined or free. Quite the opposite will be seen, as thousands of wayward teens and their other vagabonds inundated the area during the 1967 Summer of Love. They overwhelmed the Height, despoiling its environs, depleting goods and services, and often ransacking homes and businesses in their daily, desperate bid for survival. Many merchants, vendors, homeowners, and slumlords exploited the flower children's forlorn search for food, clothing, and shelter by continuing to charge exorbitant prices and rents for necessities. When most left in early September to return to the comfort and security of their white suburban neighbourhoods, Thalen's dream of a charming, bustling, aesthetically pleasing, psychedelic Hyde Street lay in shambles. Nonetheless, until that time, their shops were an integral part of the neighbourhood. Their businesses were what made the Hyde Street community, rather than just a place where hippies lived. Thalen and his fellow hip entrepreneurs saw themselves in their hamlet as a collective of artists and visionaries who believed they were offering humanity an alternative way of living, one that was independent and self-sufficient in a society defined by crass materialism, mass consumption, and recurring spasms of violence. For the most part, Thalen and others' righteous indignation about the money thing fell largely on deaf ears, as the majority of hip store owners, especially those who opened their doors at the beginning of the hippie Haight-Ashbury phenomenon, made money, often quite a lot. They simply could not help it because of the demand for their hip, cool products among their growing clientele was virtually insatiable, and thus no matter how hard they tried to eschew the profit motive, many found the temptation of financial remuneration too difficult to resist. It would be remembered that the majority of hippie merchants were the products of a very affluent American middle class. They had grown up with material abundance, and consequently, many, regardless of their condemnation of that culture, could not divorce themselves completely from its acquisitive ethos. Although none of the individuals who opened shops prior to 1967 expected to get rich off their enterprises, they did want to make money. Bobby Bowles, owner of Peg and All Leathers, who like Thalen was very community-oriented and donated generously to Height initiatives, nonetheless recalls becoming very excited about the prospect of 100,000 hippies coming to the neighbourhood during the summer of 1967. Quote, "Oh boy, if I can just get $1 from each of them," unquote. Thalen and many of the other hip merchants were capitalists in Bohemia. Worse yet, capitalists who made money, and thus, even as hippies continued to live in relative prosperity. The hip debate about money and profit reflected the first cresting of the post-World War II consumer marketplace and white middle-class affluence. As early as the 1920s, the mass production system promoted consumption rather than saving, indulgence rather than denial. Depression and war only momentarily retarded these already entrenched impulses. The American economy's spectacular growth after World War II had not only brought an end to deprivation, creating unprecedented abundance, but also spawned the first generation in American history secure in the satisfaction of all material needs. Indeed, to this first wave of baby boomers, it was rarely a matter of how much, but rather how many, and in what size, shape, colour, flavour, or softness. Such freedom from scarcity and living in the rarefied and insulated suburbs with plenty of leisure time for introspection and brooding, interestingly created many young white middle-class youth a disdain for the way their parents lived. For alienated youth of the Protestant ethic of self-denial, deferred gratification, and the disciplined life had no relevance except in their parents' efforts to impose such a regimen. Perhaps it was inevitable that rejection of middle-class comforts had to come from those having the most secure households. Working class and poor youth at the time had fewer, if any, material luxuries to rebel against. Many hipsters concluded that the price paid for economic affluence and material security had been too high. The growth ethic was destroying or already had ravaged too many individual souls and psyche, as well as the environment. As reflected in Thalen's comments, members of the hip community thus questioned the core values on which American capitalism was built. In rejecting the industrial corporate system and the ethos that sustained it, hippies potentially represented a real threat to that order. However, the counterculture's potential to undermine the nation's business corporate civilization never materialized. No matter how determined hippie dropouts were to eschew the growth ethic and its attendant values, they were children of affluence, and thus opting out meant having to live with scarcity, without all the material and creature comforts they had grown accustomed to having in their secure suburban environments. How long would someone from such a background be willing to live in such deprivation? Also reflected in the debate concerning profitable hip-owned businesses was the remarkable speed with which American corporate capitalism seized upon the momentary popularity and chic of the hippie movement. Inevitably, hippie vogue was translated into immense profits, not only for local hip merchants, but more importantly for the huge companies that mass-produced all manner of hip merchandise. Hunter S. Thompson saw this potential early on in the hippie movement, observing in 1967 that, quote, everything genuine in the Haight-Ashbury is about to be swallowed, like North Beach and Greenwich Village, in a wave of publicity and commercialism, unquote. Such remunerative commercialization of the hip lifestyle never would have occurred if there had not been such a white middle-class prosperity at the time. As the hip movement became more popular, increasing numbers of affluent white youth purchased all the appropriate apparel, emblems, and symbols associated with hippie culture and lifestyle, reflecting their fascination and identification, though peripheral for many, with the movement. By the late 1960s, multi-million-dollar hip-related industries had emerged. Many were completely new, hip-specific enterprises, such as the still San Francisco-based clothing conglomerate, The Gap, Inc., Incorporated, founded in 1969 by the hip couple Donald and Doris Fisher. The Fishers' first store on Ocean Avenue initially sold only Levi jeans and rock and roll LPs, two of the decades ongoing hottest items among consumers aged 13 to 30. Because of the enterprise's location near the Haight and the high demand among both hippies and plastic hippies, as well as among day or weekend trippers, who were straights who transformed themselves into hippies on weekends after living the square suburban corporate life for 5 days a week, for their products. In their first year of operation, the Fishers sold $2 million worth of merchandise, realizing enough profit to open a second store in San Jose, California in 1970. It was in that year, in both their establishments, that the Fishers introduced the first line of hip clothing: paisley printed shirts and blouses, bell-bottom jeans, ankle-length madras skirts, and a variety of other hip attire. Even though by that year the hippie movement was beginning to fade, the Fishers' diversification into hippie garb saw their total sales triple from the year before, as the desire among many young people to perpetuate the hippie look and identity remained popular. The Fishers were just one of many hip entrepreneurs who profited immensely from the brief but spectacular hippie phenomenon. Older, established mainstream corporations also seized upon the hippie fad, simply by diversifying their product lines into production of hip commodities. Such businesses mass-marketed all manner of colourful clothing, cosmetics, rock music, posters, and even drug paraphernalia. Most important, the rapid commercialization of hippie culture and lifestyle, especially by mainstream corporate America, reflected the establishment's economic and political power to eclipse the potential for serious disruption the counterculture might have posed. By reshaping, co-opting and filtering the counterculture, through the broader streams of American business civilization, American capitalists absorbed Dionysus into the dominant culture. Thus, the corporate establishment made it next to impossible for the hippie movement to remain uncorrupted by the very capitalist system they shunned. The crucial role of the market reveals not only the limitations of the hippie critique of the establishment culture, but also the powerful economic forces arrayed by the hippies' attempt to build a potential alternative society. In the height lived a community in opposition to bourgeois society, yet it was suffused with commercialism. Here was also a subculture which sought collectively, yet passionately, with the idea of each individual's right to do your own thing. Finally, the Heights hippie residents believed they had created a communal space within the city, encompassing a pastoral Arcadia, yet surrounding and infiltrating and despoiling their ingenuousness were individuals from the urban technological nightmare, from which they sought to insulate themselves. Yet they needed these individuals to come to the height in order to sustain the community economically. In effect, a giant cascading wave of consumerism came crashing down on the nation's first hippie land, destroying everything genuine. And as the wave receded, what was left was only the movement symbols: love beads, sandals, tie-dye clothing, hash pipes, slogans, and flowers. But these objects no longer represented anything real or affected or unaffected. The hippies' core philosophy had been obliterated by the capitalist system. These were the sorts of paradoxes that permeated the hippie impulse and community from the beginning, regardless of location. They would also explain the movement's successes and failures. Theodore Roszak from the hippies would soon be swamped with Theodore Roszak feared the hippies would soon be swamped with cynical or self-deceived opportunists, especially from the media and fashion industries who presented themselves publicly for purposes of profit as the hippies' biggest boosters, but behind closed corporate doors pursued an agenda of subverting the counterculture by reducing hippies to an amusing sideshow of the swinging society. Yet Roszak was sanguine that, despite the fraudulence and folly that collects around the edges, the counterculture would resist co-optization and exploitation. If there was one prevalent enterprise that best translated the hippies' optimistic and exuberant spirit and co-committed values to flaunt and mock convention by dressing outrageously, it was the apparel industry, which began in 1965 to adapt production to the increasing demand among young people for more eclectic, flamboyant, multi-ethnic, and just plain old-fashioned attire, ranging from workmen's overalls to tie-dye t-shirts, to dashikis, to old Mother Hubbard or granny dresses. Sales of unconventional suits, jackets, ties, elegant dresses, high heels, and white gloves plummeted as hippies and many young people in general viewed such clothing as the staid, unimaginative uniform of an uptight suburban bourgeoisie, or the formality of their parents' 1950s generation. Ward and June Cleaver. As Andy Warhol observed, the kids were throwing out all the preppy outfits and all the dress-up clothes that made them look like their mothers and fathers.